Hello and welcome. Find a comfortable space, quiet your surroundings, and allow your mind to drift away from the noise and urgency of the modern world. We are about to embark on a journey, not across continents but across centuries. A journey into a time of dazzling opulence and suffocating dread, an age of profound faith and even more profound cynicism. Our destination is 17th century France, a kingdom held in the thrall of one man, a monarch so powerful, so central to his nation's identity, that he took the very sun as his personal emblem. King Louis XIV. Imagine his court at Versailles. It is not merely a palace. It is the center of the universe. This is the world Louis built. It is an era we call the Grand Siècle, the Great Century. It gave us the brilliance of Molière's plays, the soaring music of Lully, the classical perfection of Racine's tragedies, and the meticulous gardens of Lenotre. But this gilded age was built upon a foundation of absolute, unquestionable power. And absolute power requires absolute control. Behind the shimmering facade of Versailles, with its hall of mirrors and its grand promenades, lay a darker reality. A network of spies reported on conversations in every salon. A secret police, the first of its kind in Europe, monitored the mood of Paris. And for those who displeased the king, who knew too much, or who simply represented a threat, there was an instrument of terrifying efficiency: the lettre de cachet. Think of it. A letter bearing the royal seal. It was not an arrest warrant based on evidence or charges. It was a royal command for a person to be seized and imprisoned, indefinitely, without trial, without appeal, without any legal recourse whatsoever. A signature on a piece of paper could make a person vanish from the face of the earth. They would be swallowed by the stone walls of a fortress, their name struck from records, their family forbidden to speak of them, their very existence rendered a state secret. It was into this legal and political void that our subject disappeared. Our story is about the most famous victim of this system, a prisoner who remained incarcerated for over 3 decades, from 1669 until his death in 1703. A man who was moved from prison to prison as his jailer received new posts, a living secret passed from one fortress to the next. A man who, by all credible accounts, was forced for years to conceal his face from the world behind a mask. Not the grim, torturous cage of iron that legend and cinema have given us, but something perhaps more insidious. A mask of black velvet, a soft, silent curtain that separated him from humanity. It was not designed to inflict pain, but to inflict something far worse: anonymity. It was a tool to erase a man's identity while keeping his body alive. History knows him by this apparatus. He is the man in the iron mask. The name itself is a whisper, a chilling paradox. He is defined by the very thing that was meant to render him indefinable. His story is one of the most persistent and tantalizing of all historical mysteries. It has been a playground for novelists, philosophers, and historians for 300 years. It was given its epic, swashbuckling form by the great Alexander Dumas, who spun a tale of royal intrigue and hidden parentage. It was probed by the philosopher Voltaire, who saw in the prisoner a symbol of tyrannical abuse. The questions the mystery poses are fundamental. Who was he? What crime, what knowledge, what threat could possibly justify a punishment so uniquely cruel, so utterly complete? To live for 34 years as a non-person, a ghost in the machine of the state. To die in the most notorious prison in Europe, the Bastille, and be buried in a pauper's grave under a false name. To have his cell scraped down, his furniture burned, every last physical trace of his long, silent suffering systematically obliterated. The state, in its awesome power, tried to annihilate him. But secrets of this magnitude have a life of their own. They seep through the cracks of official records. They survive in the coded letters of ministers, in the private diaries of prison officers, in the gossip of guards passed down through generations. They endure as legends. And tonight we are going to join the hunt. We will become historical detectives, sifting through the fragile, fragmented evidence left behind. We will delve into the paranoid heart of the Sun King's court. We will walk the cold stone corridors of the prisons of Pignerol, Exils, Sainte Marguerite, and the Bastille. We will assemble the lineup of suspects, the men who have been proposed over the centuries as the face behind the mask. We will weigh the theories, from the fantastically romantic to the soberingly mundane. Our goal is to peel back the layers of myth and speculation, to get as close to the truth as the centuries will allow, and to try, finally, to understand the fate of the most mysterious prisoner in all of French history. So let the world outside fall away. Our investigation begins now. Part 1. The World of the Sun King. Forging the Gilded Cage. Before we can understand the prisoner, we must first intimately understand his jailer, not the man, Saint Mars, who held the keys, but the king who forged the lock, Louis XIV. To comprehend the motive for such an extraordinary imprisonment, we must immerse ourselves in the political and psychological landscape of his reign. His famous and possibly apocryphal declaration, "L'état c'est moi," I am the state, was more than just a boast. It was the central organizing principle of his life and his kingdom. Louis was not born into the stable, all-powerful monarchy he would later perfect. He was born in 1638, his arrival hailed as Louis d'Udon, Louis the God-given, because his parents, Louis XIII and Anne of Austria, had been childless for 23 agonizing years of marriage. This narrative of a miraculous birth became a powerful piece of royal propaganda, framing him as chosen by heaven. But his childhood was not one of serene security. He was only 4 years old when his father died, and he ascended to a throne ruled in his name by his mother as regent, and her chief minister, the cunning Italian-born Cardinal Mazarin. What followed was the single most formative trauma of Louis's life, a series of brutal civil wars known as the Fronde. From 1648 to 1653, France tore itself apart. It was a complex, chaotic conflict, an uprising of powerful nobles, resentful judges, and a suffering populace, all chafing against the centralizing power of the crown and the heavy taxes levied by Mazarin to fund foreign wars. For the young king, these were years of fear and humiliation. On one occasion, a Parisian mob broke into the royal palace, demanding to see him. They stormed into his bedchamber and his mother, and in a moment of brilliant political theater, motioned for them to be quiet, to not wake the sleeping king. The crowd, awed and disarmed, filed past his bed and departed. But Louis was not asleep. He was feigning sleep, a 10-year-old boy lying perfectly still, listening to the footsteps of the mob that held his life in its hands. He never forgot that night. He never forgot the arrogance of the great princes who believed they were his equals. He never forgot the terror of being a king who was not in control. The Fronde burned a lesson into his soul. The French nobility, if left to their own devices, were a source of chaos and rebellion. They had to be broken, not with an executioner's axe, as in England, but with a more subtle weapon. When Cardinal Mazarin died in 1661, the 22-year-old Louis stunned his court by announcing that he would rule alone, without a chief minister. From that moment on, he began constructing his system of absolute control, and its centerpiece was Versailles. Before Louis, the primary royal residence was the Louvre, in the heart of Paris. But Paris was the city of the Fronde, the city of mobs and rebellion. Louis hated it. He chose his father's modest hunting lodge at Versailles, miles outside the city, and began to transform it into the most magnificent palace Europe had ever seen. Versailles was a declaration of power written in stone, gold, and glass. Its sheer scale was designed to awe and intimidate, but its true genius was social. Louis required all high-ranking nobles to spend a significant portion of the year at Versailles. He ripped them from their regional power bases, where they commanded private armies and local loyalties. He brought them to court and turned them into supplicants. Their lives, once spent governing their lands and plotting against the crown, were now consumed by a relentless quest for royal favor. Who would be invited to a hunt? Who would get the best apartments far from the smelly latrines? Who would be granted a pension or a title? It all depended on the king. He turned status into a commodity that only he could dispense. The great warrior princes of the Fronde became, in effect, his high-end servants, their days spent in ritualized attendance upon his person. This system depended on information. Louis was a voracious consumer of intelligence. He had an army of informants, from formal ambassadors to secret agents to society gossips. He would meet daily with his key ministers, men like the brilliant Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who rationalized the French economy, and the ruthless Marquis de Louvois, his minister of war. They would present their reports, but Louis also cultivated back-channels. He would listen to a courtier's complaint about a minister, or a lady-in-waiting's whisper about a general's debts. He built a web of knowledge with himself at the center, a spider sensing every vibration. It was Louvois, a man of brutal efficiency and unwavering loyalty to the state, who was most directly involved in the case of our prisoner. He controlled the army, logistics, and the prison system. When the king needed someone to disappear, it was Louvois who would sign the order. It was Louvois who would select the prison, and it was Louvois who would draft the chillingly precise instructions for the jailer. This was the context for the lettre de cachet. It was the ultimate expression of the king's power, a bypass of the entire legal system. The parliaments, the high courts of France, had been a source of opposition during the Fronde. With the lettre de cachet, Louis could silence dissent without ever having to justify his actions in a courtroom. The reasons for imprisonment could be political, a writer publishing a seditious pamphlet; personal, a nobleman whose debauchery embarrassed the court; or even familial, a powerful father asking the king to imprison a rebellious son. The fortress of the Bastille in Paris was the most famous destination, but there were others scattered across the kingdom. The citadel of Vincennes, the Alpine fortress of Pignerol, the island prison of Sainte Marguerite. These were not common jails. They were state prisons designed to hold not ordinary criminals, but enemies of the king. And within this system there were levels of secrecy. Some prisoners were held openly, others were held under false names. And then there was one, a single captive whose secrecy was so paramount that his very face had to be hidden. This is the world that created the Man in the Iron Mask. A world ruled by a king obsessed with control, traumatized by rebellion, and armed with the absolute power to erase a human being from society. The motive for the prisoner's fate, whatever it was, must be understood within this framework. It was not a simple crime. It must have been a threat to the very structure of power that Louis had so painstakingly built. A threat to the image of the Sun King himself. Part 2. The Arrival of a Shadow, Pignerol, 1669. Our story's first tangible event occurs in the late summer of 1669. The location is Pignerol, a formidable fortress nestled in the foothills of the Italian Alps. At the time, Pignerol, or Pinerolo in Italian, was a French possession, a strategic key guarding the mountain passes into Italy. Its citadel was a grim, isolated, and highly secure state prison, the perfect place to make someone disappear. The governor of this prison was a man named Benign d'Auvergne de Saint-Mars. We must pause to understand him, for his destiny would be forever intertwined with that of his secret prisoner. Saint-Mars was a former musketeer, a man of ambition but modest origins. His entire career, his wealth, and his status would be built upon one singular solemn duty: to be the perfect jailer for the king's most secret captives. He was diligent, meticulous, and above all discreet. He understood that his own fortune depended on his ability to keep the secrets entrusted to him. In July of 1669, Saint-Mars received a letter that would define the rest of his life. It came from Paris, from the powerful minister of war, the Marquis de Louvois. The letter was a masterpiece of controlled threat and precise instruction. It informed Saint Mars that he was to expect the arrival of a prisoner, to be delivered by a Captain de Voroy. The prisoner's name was given as Eustache Dogger. Louvois' instructions were unlike any Saint Mars had received before. He was to prepare a special cell for this Dogger. The cell must have multiple doors, one closing upon the other, to prevent any sound from escaping or being overheard. Saint Mars was to see this prisoner only once a day to deliver his food and other necessities, and under no circumstances was he to listen to what the prisoner might say. The letter contained a terrifyingly explicit command. You must threaten him with death if he speaks to you of anything other than his needs. Think about the implications of that order. It wasn't just, do not let him speak to others. It was, do not even listen to him yourself. The prisoner's knowledge was considered so toxic that even the trusted governor of the prison was to be shielded from it. Louvois ended the letter by reminding Saint Mars that the king's satisfaction, and by extension Saint Mars's own career, depended on his absolute fidelity in this matter. A month later, in late August, Captain de Voroy arrived with his charge. Eustache Dogger was handed over, and the first door of his prison cell closed behind him. For the next 34 years, he would never know a moment of true freedom again. Pignerol at this time was a kind of high-security club for the king's most distinguished enemies. The most famous inmate was Nicolas Fouquet, the fantastically wealthy and ambitious superintendent of finances. Fouquet had been arrested in 1661 in a spectacular downfall. He had dared to build a chateau, Vaux-le-Vicomte, so magnificent, and host a party so lavish, that it aroused the jealousy and suspicion of the young Louis XIV. Accused of embezzlement, Fouquet was subjected to a show trial and sentenced to banishment. Louis, in an act of cold vindictiveness, overruled the court and changed the sentence to life imprisonment. Fouquet was the living symbol of what happened to those who challenged the Sun King's ascendancy. Another notable prisoner was the Comte de Lauzun, an arrogant and fiery courtier who had secretly married the king's cousin, the Grande Mademoiselle. For this act of presumption, he was locked away in Pignerol for 10 years. These were great men, powerful figures. Their imprisonment was political, but their identities were known. They were allowed servants, correspondence, albeit censored, and a degree of comfort befitting their station. The prisoner known as Eustache Dogger was different. His treatment was a paradox. On the one hand, he was given what he needed. His meals were adequate. He was not physically tortured. But on the other hand, he was subjected to an isolation and a psychological pressure that was absolute. The order that he be killed if he spoke of his past was the defining condition of his existence. Who was this Eustache Dogger? The name itself is a mystery. There are historical records of a Eustache Dogger de Cavoy, a man from a noble family who was involved in some truly sordid affairs, including debauchery and possibly a black mass. He was disinherited and known to have been imprisoned, but his timeline and circumstances do not match our prisoner's. It is far more likely that Eustache Dogger was a pseudonym, a name chosen for its relative obscurity to be entered into the official letter, a cover for the prisoner's true identity. One detail from Louvois' letter has puzzled historians for centuries. After giving his terrifying instructions, he adds a strange, almost dismissive line. He is only a valet. A valet. A servant. This single phrase is the crux of the entire mystery. Why would a mere valet warrant security measures far exceeding those for a fallen superminister like Fouquet or a count like Lauzun? Seems to be a contradiction. If he was unimportant, why the secrecy? If the secrecy was so vital, how could he be unimportant? This is the puzzle that Saint Mars was left to manage in his Alpine fortress. For years, the prisoner lived in his specially prepared cell. He was the secret within the prison, his existence known only to Saint Mars, Louvois, and the king. Life at Pignerol continued. Fouquet and Lauzun plotted and bribed guards. They even managed to have secret conversations. But the man called Dogger remained in his silent world. At one point, when Fouquet's own valet died, Saint-Mars, in a moment of logistical desperation, temporarily assigned Dogger to serve the old minister. But the orders were strict. He was only to serve Fouquet when Lauzun, who was allowed to visit Fouquet, was not present. The fear was clearly that Lauzun, if he saw the man's face or heard his voice, might recognize him. After Fouquet's death in 1680, this brief, limited contact with the outside world ended. The prisoner was once again alone with his secret. In 1681, Saint-Mars's diligent service was rewarded. He was promoted to be the governor of the nearby fortress of XIV. And when he packed his belongings for the move, he also packed his secret. The prisoner was transported under heavy guard. His face now, according to later accounts, covered by a mask. The legend was beginning to take shape. For 6 years, he remained at XIV. Then in 1687, another promotion for Saint-Mars, this time to a far more prestigious and profitable post, governor of the prison on the Mediterranean island of Sainte Marguerite. Sainte Marguerite is a beautiful island, a short boat ride from the coast of what is now Cannes. But its beauty was a cruel irony for its prisoners. It was a place of complete isolation surrounded by the sea. It was here, during his 11-year incarceration, that the masked prisoner became a local legend. An officer who served at the prison later recalled seeing him. He described a man who would walk on the battlements, always masked. The guards had orders to shoot him if he tried to remove the mask or communicate with anyone. The islanders would gaze across the water at the fortress, whispering stories about the silent, masked figure. One of the most famous, though likely embellished, tales from this period claims a fisherman found a silver plate that had been thrown from the prison window. Scratched onto the plate was a message. The fisherman, unable to read, brought it to the governor. Saint-Mars, his face pale, asked the man, "Have you read this? Has anyone else seen it?" When the fisherman swore he had not, Saint-Mars held him until he was convinced the man was telling the truth, releasing him only with the words, "It is lucky for you that you cannot read." The story is probably a romantic invention, but it captures the essence of the prisoner's situation. He was a man bursting with a secret he could never tell. Finally, in 1698, Saint-Mars received the capstone of his career. He was made governor of the most important state prison in the kingdom, the Bastille in Paris. It was the ultimate position of trust for a man whose profession was keeping secrets. And so the 60-year-old prisoner, who had known nothing but prison walls for 29 years, was prepared for his final journey. He was transported from the sunny Mediterranean to the heart of Paris in a covered litter, a kind of enclosed sedan chair, to ensure that no one on the long road north could catch a glimpse of his face. On September 18, 1698, the convoy arrived at the Bastille. The prison's lieutenant, a man named Dujonca, recorded the event in his official diary, a document that has become one of our most precious primary sources. He wrote, "At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Monsieur de Saint-Mars, governor of the Bastille, arrived for his first entry, bringing with him a prisoner he had at Pignerol, whom he keeps always masked, whose name is not spoken. The shadow had arrived in Paris. For 5 years, he lived in the Bernardière Tower of the Bastille. He was treated with a strange mixture of respect and extreme security. The governor himself served his meals. He was allowed to play the lute. The prison physician who attended to him in his final illness described him as remarkably well made. A man who never complained and expressed great piety. But the mask remained. The silence remained. Then on November 19, 1703, after a short illness, the prisoner died. He was, according to the records, about 60 years old. The state's machinery of erasure, which had been running for 34 years, went into its final phase. The body was quickly buried the next day in the parish cemetery of Saint-Paul-de-Champs. In the parish register, under the list of the dead, an entry was made. On this day Marchioli, aged about 45, died in the Bastille. The name was false. The age was wrong. It was one last piece of deliberate misinformation. Saint Mars's son-in-law later recounted that the prisoner's cell was stripped. His clothes, his bedding, his loot, any small personal items he might have had were all burned. The walls were scraped down and whitewashed, the floor tiles pulled up, to ensure no hidden note, no scratched message could ever be found. The state had done everything in its power to make the man a complete void. But they failed. They had created a mystery too compelling to be forgotten. And in doing so they created a legend. Now we must turn our attention to the question they tried so hard to prevent anyone from ever asking. Who was he? Part 3. The Hall of Mirrors. Investigating the candidates. We now enter the heart of our investigation. Over the 3 centuries since the prisoner's death, a long list of candidates has been proposed. The search for his identity is a journey through the hidden history of the 17th century, a world of diplomatic intrigue, court scandals, and royal secrets. We must act as cold case detectives, examining each suspect, weighing the evidence for and against, and peeling back the layers of myth to find the historical truth. We will begin with the most famous, most dramatic, and most enduring theory of all. Candidate 1. The royal phantom, a brother to the king. This is the theory that has captured the imagination of the world. It is the version immortalized by Alexandre Dumas in the final part of his D'Artagnan series, the Vicomte de Bragelonne, a section of which is titled The Man in the Iron Mask. It is a story so powerful that for many, it has become the truth. The theory, first given serious credence by the philosopher Voltaire, posits that the prisoner was no less than the identical twin brother of King Louis XIV. Let us reconstruct the narrative as it has been told. On September 5, 1638, Queen Anne of Austria, after 2 decades of childlessness, gives birth to a healthy son, the Dauphin Louis. The kingdom rejoices. The succession is secure. But then, hours later, a second identical boy is born. The king, Louis XIII, and his powerful chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, are faced with a constitutional and political crisis of the highest order. The existence of a royal twin was unprecedented in French history. Who was the rightful heir? The firstborn by tradition. But what if their births were so close together that it was difficult to tell? What if one twin was stronger or smarter? More dangerous still was the potential for future conflict. An identical twin was a perfect body double, a ready-made pretender to the throne. He would be a magnet for every disgruntled nobleman, every foreign power seeking to destabilize France. His very existence would be a permanent invitation to civil war. So, a terrible and secret decision is made. The second-born twin is spirited away from the court. He is raised in obscurity by trusted guardians, given a gentleman's education, but kept ignorant of his true parentage. Years pass. Louis XIV is now the Sun King in all his glory. But somehow the secret is revealed. Perhaps the twin, now a young man, discovers a hidden letter. Perhaps a dying guardian confesses. Or perhaps a faction at court, hostile to the king, uncovers the truth and plans to use the twin to usurp the throne. The man whose only crime was his birth suddenly becomes the most dangerous person in the kingdom. What is Louis to do? He cannot simply have him executed. To kill his own brother, his identical twin, would be an act of kinslaying, a monstrous crime against God and nature. It would risk eternal damnation and, if discovered, would shatter the sacred image of the monarchy. But he cannot allow him to remain free. So he devises a unique and terrible solution. He will imprison his brother for life. But since his face is the same as the king's, it must be hidden at all times. He is to be given the comforts befitting a man of high birth, fine clothes, good food out of some remnant of familial duty, but he is to be utterly silenced and sequestered. His identity is to be erased. He becomes the masked prisoner. It is a breathtakingly dramatic story. It explains everything with perfect symmetrical logic. The lifelong sentence? Necessary as the threat never diminishes. The extraordinary secrecy? Essential to hide a secret that could topple the throne. The respectful treatment reported by Voltaire? A concession to his royal blood. The mask? The absolute core of the plan to hide the king's own face. Voltaire, who was himself imprisoned in the Bastille in the early 18th century, heard the rumors from older guards and inmates. He was the first to publicize the theory in his Age of Louis XIV. He wrote that the prisoner was of a height as lofty as the king, and that the minister Louvois showed him extraordinary deference, speaking to him standing up and not taking a seat. For Voltaire, a fierce critic of royal absolutism, the story was a perfect allegory for the inhumanity of unchecked power. But as compelling as it is as a work of historical analysis, the royal twin theory collapses under the slightest pressure. First, and most decisively, is the impossibility of the secret birth itself. The birth of a French heir was not a private family moment. It was a public state-sanctioned event. The Queen's bedchamber would have been crowded with physicians, ministers, high-ranking nobles, and ladies-in-waiting. Their presence was legally required, precisely to prevent any substitution of infants or other deceptions. The birth of Louis de Udon was a moment of immense national relief and celebration. The idea that a second identical baby could have been born, cleaned, and smuggled out of the room with dozens of high-profile witnesses present, and that every single one of them remained silent for the rest of their lives, is simply beyond the realm of possibility. It would have been the greatest conspiracy in European history, and not a single contemporary diary, letter, or memoir hints at it. Second, the timeline is problematic. Third, the details of the prisoner's treatment don't quite align with someone of royal blood. While he was treated better than a common criminal, the constant threat of death for speaking seems an odd way to treat a brother, even an imprisoned one. And would the king truly entrust his own twin to a career jailer like Saint Mars, a man of relatively low standing? It is more likely such a prisoner would have been kept in a royal chateau, a gilded cage guarded by the highest echelons of the nobility. The royal twin theory is a myth. It is perhaps the greatest myth of the French monarchy. It speaks to deep archetypes of the doppelganger, the hidden sibling, the dark shadow of a great man. It is a brilliant story, but it is not history. We must, regretfully, dismiss this candidate and move from the world of romantic fiction to the grittier realities of 17th-century politics. Candidate 2. The disgraced General Vivien de Bulland. Let us now consider a candidate rooted not in myth, but in a specific military failure and a tantalizing piece of coded evidence. His name was Vivien Lab de Bulland, a general in Louis XIV's army. The setting is the 9 Years' War, a sprawling conflict pitting France against a grand alliance of European powers. In 1691, General de Bulland was tasked with besieging the town of Cuneo in the Italian region of Piedmont. The siege was progressing when Bulland received intelligence, which later turned out to be false, that a superior Austrian force was approaching to relieve the town. In a moment of sheer panic, Bulland made a disastrous decision. He abruptly lifted the siege and fled, ordering a hasty retreat. In his haste, he abandoned his cannons, his ammunition, and most shamefully, his wounded soldiers, leaving them to the mercy of the enemy. For Louis XIV, this was an unforgivable act. The king took military affairs personally. His army's glory was his glory. An act of cowardice that led to such a public humiliation was a stain on the honor of France and a direct insult to the king. Louis's rage was said to be legendary. The primary evidence linking Bulland to the masked prisoner comes from the diligent work of French military cryptographers in the late 19th century. They managed to decipher a coded letter from the minister Louvois to a military commander, written shortly after the Cuneo fiasco. The letter details Bulan's cowardice and gives a clear order for his punishment. His Majesty desires that you have him immediately arrested and conducted to the fortress of Pignerol, where he will be locked in a cell, masked by day, and allowed to walk the battlements. On the surface, this seems to be a bombshell. We have an official letter from the correct minister, ordering a specific individual to be taken to one of the prisons associated with our story, Pignerol. And most crucially, it contains the explicit order that he be masked. This is the only known contemporary document that directly orders the masking of a specific, named prisoner. For a time it seemed the mystery was solved. The man in the mask was a cowardly general being punished for disgracing the king. However, as with all things in this mystery, the details refused to cooperate. The most glaring problem is the timeline. The incident at Cuneo occurred in 1691. The prisoner we are tracking, the man brought to Pignerol under the name Eustache Dogger, was first incarcerated in 1669. That is a 22-year discrepancy. Our prisoner had already been locked away for over 2 decades when General de Bulan committed his crime. The letter from Louvois is clearly referring to a new punishment for a new offense. Furthermore, Bulan's disgrace, while severe, was not a permanent state secret. His name was known, his crime was discussed, and his punishment, while harsh, was not lifelong. Public and military records show that General de Bulan was eventually released from prison. He returned to his home, and he died in 1709, 6 years after our masked prisoner died in the Bastille. His death was publicly recorded under his own name. So, while the story of General de Bulan is fascinating and provides proof that masking was indeed a punishment used at the time, he cannot be our man. He is a red herring. The order to mask him might suggest that this was a rare but standardized punishment for crimes of particular shame, but it does not solve the central mystery of the man imprisoned since 1669. The search must continue. Candidate 3. The deceitful diplomat Count Ercole Antonio Mattioli. We now turn to a candidate who, for over a century, was considered by most serious historians to be the definitive solution to the mystery. His case is grounded in the treacherous world of international espionage and a direct, personal betrayal of the Sun King. His name was Count Ercole Antonio Mattioli. Mattioli was an Italian nobleman, a minister and secretary of state for the financially troubled Charles IV, Duke of Mantua. In the late 1670s, Louis XIV had a secret and strategically vital objective: to acquire the fortress of Casale. Casale was a heavily fortified town on the Po River, belonging to the Duke of Mantua. Its location made it the gateway to Lombardy and a crucial military foothold for France in northern Italy. Gaining control of Casale would give Louis a dagger to hold at the throat of Spanish-controlled Milan. The acquisition had to be handled with the utmost discretion. If France's rivals Spain, Austria, or Savoy discovered the plan, they would move to block it immediately. The Duke of Mantua was short on cash and known to be receptive to a deal, but it had to be secret. The man the Duke chose to act as his secret envoy in this delicate negotiation was Count Mattioli. In 1678, Mattioli traveled to Paris in secret. He met with Louis's ministers and was even granted a private audience with the king himself at Versailles. He was charming, persuasive, and seemingly trustworthy. A deal was struck. France would pay the Duke of Mantua 100,000 crowns for Casale. Mattioli himself was promised a handsome reward for his services, including a valuable diamond ring and a sum of money. He returned to Italy with the signed treaty, tasked with getting the Duke's final ratification. The French began to move troops into the area, ready to occupy the fortress as soon as the deal was finalized. And then, Mattioli committed an act of catastrophic treachery. For reasons that are still debated, perhaps he was bribed with a better offer from another power, perhaps it was an act of breathtaking arrogance, or perhaps simple foolishness double-crossed the Sun King. He revealed the entire secret treaty to the French ambassador in Venice and then proceeded to leak the details to the courts of Spain, Austria, Savoy, and Venice. The diplomatic world exploded. The secret was out. Louis XIV's plan was in ruins. His ambitions in Italy thwarted. He was publicly humiliated on the European stage, made to look like a grasping schemer who had been outwitted by a minor Italian count. The rage in Versailles must have been volcanic. This was not a military failure in the field. This was a personal betrayal by a man who had been received at court, who had negotiated in the king's name, and who had taken the king's money. Louis XIV was not a man who suffered insults, let alone betrayals of this magnitude. He resolved to make an example of Mattioli. A trap was set. Mattioli was lured to a supposed meeting near the French border, believing he was going to receive his payment. Instead, in May of 1679, he was ambushed by French agents, bundled across the frontier, and thrown into the fortress of Pignerol. He was delivered directly into the custody of our familiar jailer, Governor St. Mars. The case for Mattioli as the man in the iron mask is exceptionally strong. First, the motive is perfect. Betraying a secret state affair after meeting the king personally is a crime of lèse-majesté, an offense against the king's sovereign dignity. It would absolutely warrant a severe, secret, and lifelong punishment. Second, the timing and location fit. Mattioli was imprisoned in Pignerol in 1679, under the care of St. Mars. While this is 10 years after the initial arrest of Dogger, it's possible the legend conflated two separate secret prisoners. Third, Mattioli was a person of rank, a count, and a minister. This would align with the reports from Voltaire and others that the prisoner was treated with a degree of respect. Fourth, and most compellingly, there is the name on the Bastille death register. Marchioli. This seems too close to Mattioli to be a coincidence. It appears to be a deliberate, slightly altered version of his name, a final cryptic clue left in the official record. This theory was so convincing that for generations, it was the accepted historical truth. It was adopted by historians in the 19th century and became the standard explanation. However, a closer examination of the prison records and correspondence, particularly the work of 20th century historians, has cast serious doubt on the Mattioli theory. The evidence that once seemed so strong begins to fray. Letters from St. Mars himself seem to make a clear distinction between two separate secret prisoners under his care. He refers to Mattioli by name in some letters, complaining about his behavior and his constant lies. In other letters, he refers to his old prisoner or the prisoner from the lower tower, the one he had been guarding for much longer, the one who required the most stringent security. This strongly suggests that Mattioli and the original 1669 prisoner, Dogger, were two different men, held in the same prison at the same time. Furthermore, the conditions of their imprisonment were different. Mattioli was, at times, allowed to have a valet. The original prisoner, as per Louvois' strict orders, was to be kept in absolute isolation. There are also accounts suggesting that Mattioli was considered a nuisance and a madman by his jailers, hardly the dignified, pious figure described by the Bastille's physician. The final blow to the theory is evidence that Mattioli may never have even left the Alpine prisons. Some records indicate that he became seriously ill and died either at Pignerol or on the island of Sainte Marguerite in 1694, nearly a decade before the masked prisoner died in the Bastille. If this is true, he cannot be our man. And what of the name Marchioli? While tantalizing, it could be a coincidence. Or it could have been a deliberately misleading name chosen by St. Mars because he knew of Mattioli and wanted to create a false trail. Mattioli was undoubtedly a real secret prisoner, a victim of Louis XIV's vengeance. His story is a dramatic one in its own right. But the weight of the evidence now suggests that he was not the man in the iron mask. He was another secret, but not the deepest one. The true secret, the one dating back to 1669, still lay hidden in the lower tower of Pignerol. This brings us to our final and most likely candidate, a man whose very obscurity is the key to the entire mystery. Part 4. The Heart of the Shadow, Eustache Dogger and the Sins of Versailles. We have journeyed through the realms of myth, military disgrace, and diplomatic treachery. We have dismissed the royal twin, the cowardly general, and the treacherous count. We now return to the name from the very beginning, the name in Louvois' letter to Saint Mars in 1669, Eustache Dogger. And we must confront the central paradox. How could a man described as only a valet be the subject of the most profound state secret of the century? The answer, most modern historians believe, is that the threat Dogger posed was not in who he was but in what he knew. A valet in the 17th century was not just a servant who laid out clothes. In a great household, a trusted valet was an intimate, a confidant, a man who was invisible but saw and heard everything. He was present for private conversations, he carried secret letters, he knew his master's finances, his politics, and most dangerously, his indiscretions. A valet was a living repository of secrets. So if Eustache Dogger was the prisoner, our investigation shifts from who was he to two far more difficult questions. Whose valet was he? And what devastating secret had he uncovered? The search for these answers takes us deep into the darkest and most scandalous corners of the Sun King's reign. The Fouquet connection. One of the earliest theories linking Dogger to a specific secret involves the man who was his fellow prisoner at Pignerol, the fallen finance minister, Nicolas Fouquet. Fouquet's downfall in 1661 was not just about embezzlement. He was a man who had built his own parallel state, with his own network of spies and loyalists. He knew the intricate and often corrupt financial dealings of the entire French elite, including many who had turned against him. It's possible that Eustache Dogger was a valet or an agent in Fouquet's network, who knew things that even Fouquet's trial had not brought to light, secrets that could have implicated very powerful people, perhaps even the Queen Mother, Anne of Austria, or the late Cardinal Mazarin, whose own fortune was dubiously acquired. Imprisoning Dogger in the same fortress as Fouquet, but keeping them strictly separate, could have been a way of containing a related threat. This theory is plausible, but it has a major weakness. Fouquet died in prison in 1680. If the secret was related to him, why would the state continue to hold Dogger in such extreme secrecy for another 23 years? With Fouquet dead, the threat should have diminished. Yet, the security around the masked prisoner never lessened. This suggests the secret he held was not about a dead minister, but about something still alive, still dangerous, and closer to the king himself. This leads us to the most compelling, most shocking, and most widely accepted theory among professional historians today. It connects Eustache Dogger to the greatest single scandal to ever rock the court of Louis XIV, the affair of the poisons. The abyss opens. The affair of the poisons, l'affaire de poisons. To understand this theory, we must step away from the prisoner for a moment and descend into the Parisian underworld of the 1670s. Beneath the glittering surface of the court, a hidden economy of darkness thrived. Fortune-tellers, alchemists, abortionists, and sorcerers catered to the anxieties and ambitions of all social classes. And among their wares were so-called inheritance powders and love potions, euphemisms for deadly poisons and powerful aphrodisiacs. In 1676, the execution of a noblewoman, the Marquise de Brinvilliers, for poisoning her father and brothers to claim their inheritance, exposed the terrifying prevalence of this practice. The public was gripped by a poison panic. The king, determined to root out this cancer, established a special tribunal in 1679 called the Chamber Ardente, or the Burning Court, so named for the black-draped room lit by torches where it convened. The investigation began by targeting a charismatic and well-connected fortune-teller named Catherine Monvoisin, known as La Voisin. Her arrest opened a Pandora's box. Under interrogation, La Voisin and her network of associates began to name their clients. The list was a who's who of the French aristocracy. Dozens of prominent figures at court were implicated in buying poisons to eliminate rivals or spouses, love potions to secure lovers, and even participating in blasphemous rituals to gain power and influence. The testimony grew darker and more disturbing. The investigators heard tales of black masses, satanic rituals where priests consecrated demonic hosts over the naked bodies of women, and the sacrifice of infants to dark entities. Paris and the court at Versailles was seized by a wave of horror and paranoia. No one knew who could be trusted. But the most explosive revelation of all was yet to come. The investigation began to point directly at the heart of the king's own court, to the most powerful woman in France besides the queen. France was Athénaïs de Roquecourt, the Marquise de Montespan. Madame de Montespan was the king's official mistress, his maîtresse en titre. She was brilliant, beautiful, and ambitious, and for more than a decade, she had reigned as the unofficial queen of Versailles. She had borne the king 7 children, all of whom he had legitimized. But by the late 1670s, her position was precarious. The king's passion for her was cooling, and he had taken a new younger lover, the pious and gentle Angelique de Fontanges. Terrified of losing her power, Montespan, according to the testimony of Lavoisin's daughter and others, had turned to the dark arts. It was alleged that for years, she had been a client of Lavoisin. She had supposedly purchased love potions, made from ingredients like Spanish fly and animal glands, which she secretly administered to the king in his food to maintain his affection. But the accusations went further, into the realm of pure horror. It was claimed that Montespan had participated directly in black masses, hoping to bewitch the king, curse her rivals, and even it was whispered to poison the king should he ever try to cast her aside. This was the ultimate taboo. The mother of the king's children, a woman at the center of his court, implicated in sacrilege, witchcraft, and potential regicide. When Louis XIV was informed of these accusations, he was faced with an unimaginable crisis. This was a secret that could destroy the moral foundation of his monarchy. The image of the most Christian king, God's chosen ruler, would be irrevocably tarnished if it became known that his court was a hotbed of Satanism, and that his own mistress was at the center of it. The king acted decisively to suppress the scandal. In 1682, he abruptly shut down the Chamber Ardente. He ordered the official records of the investigation to be sealed. The most incriminating files, particularly those mentioning Madame de Montespan, were taken to his private study, where he personally burned them. Key witnesses who knew too much were not executed publicly, but were instead imprisoned for life under lettre de cachet, silenced forever. Lavoisin herself was burned at the stake before she could reveal everything she knew in a public trial. The official narrative was sanitized. The affair of the poisons was officially over. But the secrets remained, locked away in fortresses or buried in the memories of those who had been silenced. Connecting the dots. Dogger's fatal knowledge. Now let us return to Eustache Dogger, arrested in 1669. The timeline at first seems not to fit, as the main panic of the affair of the poisons was in the late 1670s. However, the dark arts network of Lavoisin and others had been active for years, even decades, before the official investigation. The theory goes that Eustache Dogger, in his capacity as a valet, became entangled in these dark dealings long before they became a public scandal. There are several possibilities, each of which would have been a death sentence, or in his case, a life in a mask sentence. A valet to a conspirator. Dogger may have been the servant of a nobleman or noblewoman who was one of Lavoisin's early clients. He might have been the one sent to procure the potions or deliver the messages. He might have been a witness to a secret ritual, or an overheard conversation that implicated someone of the highest rank. A connection to a diplomatic secret. Some historians, like Andrew Lang in the early 20th century, theorized that Dogger was the valet of a Huguenot conspirator involved in a secret treaty with England's Charles II, a plot that Louis XIV discovered and had to suppress. This is plausible but lacks the sheer explosive power of the poison scandal. The overheard secret. The most compelling version of the theory is that Dogger stumbled upon the ultimate secret by accident. He may have been a valet in a household visited by Madame de Montespan, or a servant to one of her confidants. In this position, he could have overheard a conversation or seen a letter that directly linked the king's mistress to witchcraft and poison. Perhaps he learned of her dealings with La Voisin. Perhaps he even learned of a plot against the king or a rival. If Eustache Dogger knew this secret in 1669, years before the king himself learned of it, he would have been a walking time bomb. The information was so toxic that it could not be allowed to exist. The order for his arrest would have come from a minister acting on the highest authority to neutralize a threat to the stability of the state itself. The line in the letter, "He is only a valet," could then be interpreted as a masterful piece of psychological control. Louvois was telling Saint-Mars, "This man is unimportant in his person, so do not get curious. His importance lies only in the need for his silence. Do not try to learn his secret or use it for your own gain. Just follow the orders." This theory explains everything. It explains the timing of the 1669 arrest, placing it within the active period of the poison network. It explains the extreme lifelong secrecy. It explains why a man of low birth would warrant such an extraordinary punishment. It explains the constant fear that he might speak. The secret was not about who he was, but about the sin of a powerful woman and the potential ruin of a king's reputation. The mask was not to hide a royal face, but to annihilate the identity of a common man who knew too much. He had to be made a non-person because he carried a non-truth, a fact that the state had decided must never have happened. Part 5. The Echo in Eternity. Unmasking the Legacy. Our long investigation has taken us through the gilded halls of Versailles and into the darkest dungeons of the French penal system. We have stood in the crowded birthing chamber of a king, on the bloody battlefield of a cowardly general, and in the secret negotiating rooms of a treacherous diplomat. We have descended into the Parisian underworld of poisoners and sorcerers. And now we must step back and assess what we have found. Have we solved the mystery? Have we, after 300 years, finally lifted the velvet mask? The answer is a qualified yes. The consensus of modern, mainstream historical scholarship has settled upon one man, Eustache Dogger. The evidence trail from the initial arrest warrant in 1669 naming him, to his 34-year journey in the custody of a single jailer, Saint-Mars, aligns too perfectly to be dismissed. The other candidates, the royal twin, the general, the count, are compelling characters, but they are ultimately phantoms created by myth, misinterpretation, or the conflation of separate cases. The historical record, thin as it is, points to Dogger, but to name the man is only half the solution. The core of the mystery, the why, remains tantalizingly beyond the reach of definitive proof. The theory connecting him to the affair of the poisons, specifically to a secret about the king's mistress, Madame de Montespan, is the most powerful and comprehensive explanation we have. It provides a motive commensurate with the punishment. It explains why a simple valet would be so dangerous. It accounts for the king's personal investment in the prisoner's absolute and eternal silence. Yet we must be honest. It remains a theory. A well-supported, logical, and widely accepted theory, but a theory nonetheless. Louis XIV was successful in his cover-up. He burned the most crucial files. He silenced the key witnesses. He took the precise nature of Eustache Dogger's fatal knowledge to the grave. The absolute certainty that we crave as detectives of the past is denied to us. And perhaps this is the true reason for the story's incredible longevity. The Man in the Iron Mask is not just an unsolved case. He is a perfect vessel for our own fascinations and fears. The mystery endures because it operates on multiple levels. It is a detective story, a historical whodunit that invites us to sift through clues and debate the evidence. It engages our intellect and our curiosity. It is a Gothic horror story, a tale of a man buried alive, of identity theft on a state-sponsored scale. It speaks to our primal fear of being erased, of losing our name, our face, our place in the world. The prisoner is a human void, a symbol of ultimate helplessness in the face of an omnipotent system. It is a political parable. For Voltaire, he was a symbol of the barbarity of tyranny. For Dumas, he was a symbol of legitimacy and the injustice of royal bloodlines. For us today, he can be seen as a symbol of the eternal struggle between the individual and the state, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of due process. The myth has become more powerful than the man ever was. The name Eustache Dogger, a probable nobody, has been almost entirely forgotten by popular culture. But his alter ego, the man in the iron mask, has achieved a kind of immortality. He is an archetype, a figure of enduring mystery who haunts the margins of one of history's most glorious reigns. He is the permanent shadow cast by the Sun King. Our journey tonight ends where it began, with a question. But now the question is not just who was he, but also what does he mean? He represents the triumph of legend over fact, the stubborn refusal of a secret to die, and the power of a human story to resonate across the ages, even when its central character has no name and no face. He is a testament to the fact that history is not a settled account of the past, but a living, breathing conversation, full of echoes, whispers, and empty spaces that we are compelled to fill. And now, I turn that conversation over to you. Having heard the evidence, having walked through the theories, what do you believe? Does the case for Eustache Dogger and the affair of the poisons convince you? Or do you feel the ghost of Count Mattioli still lingers? His betrayal a more fitting crime for the punishment? Do you believe the truth could be something else entirely? A secret so profound that we have not even begun to guess at its nature? The great historical mysteries are not meant to be solved and filed away. They are meant to be pondered. They belong to all of us who are fascinated by the past. Please, share your own theories, your questions, and your conclusions in the comments below. The community we build here, dedicated to exploring these fascinating corners of history, is the most rewarding part of this journey. If you have found yourself captivated by this deep dive into the shadows of the Grand Siècle, I invite you to subscribe and join us for future investigations. There are countless other stories waiting to be told, other secrets waiting to be unearthed. Thank you for lending me your time and your imagination tonight. As you go about your day or as you drift off to sleep, perhaps you will spare a thought for that silent prisoner. A man who lived for 34 years as a phantom, his identity sacrificed to protect the power of a king. A man who was meant to be forgotten, but who, through the sheer force of his own mystery, has been remembered for centuries. A silent ghost of French history who continues to speak to us, not with the voice, but with the question that echoes through time. Part 2. The 34-Year Silence, a Prisoner's Odyssey. We now leave the glittering halls of Versailles and descend into the cold, silent world of the state prison. Our focus shifts from the king to his captive. For 34 years, the man who would become the legend of the man in the iron mask traveled through the French penal system, a human parcel passed from one fortress to another. His journey was not his own. It was dictated by the career path of a single man, his jailer Benign d'Auvergne de Saint-Mars. To trace the prisoner's path is to trace the life of Saint-Mars, the man whose entire professional existence became dedicated to the guardianship of this one terrible secret. Chapter 1. Pignerol, 1669–1681. The First Cage. Our story becomes tangible in the late summer of 1669, at the fortress of Pignerol. Today, the town of Pinerolo is in Italy, but in the 17th century, it was a key French possession, a strategic citadel guarding the mountain passes from Dauphiné into Piedmont. Its high, grim fortress was considered exceptionally secure, making it the ideal location for high-value state prisoners. The governor of Pignerol was Benign d'Auvergne de Saint-Mars. Saint-Mars was not a great nobleman. He was a career soldier, a former musketeer, a man of diligence and ambition. He understood that in the service of Louis XIV, absolute loyalty and discretion were the keys to advancement. He was, in short, the perfect man for the job he was about to receive. In July of 1669, a letter arrived for Saint-Mars from Paris. It was penned by the most powerful and feared man in the kingdom next to the king himself, the Minister of War, the Marquis de Louvois. This letter, which has survived in the French archives, is the foundational document of our entire mystery. It informed Saint-Mars that he was to expect the imminent arrival of a new prisoner, to be delivered by a Captain de Voroy. The prisoner's name, Louvois wrote, was Eustache Dogger. The instructions that followed were extraordinary, even by the standards of the time. Louvois commanded Saint-Mars to prepare a special cell. This cell was to be equipped with multiple doors, one closing upon the other, designed as a kind of airlock to muffle any sound and prevent any possible communication with the outside. Saint-Mars himself was to be the sole point of contact. He was to visit the prisoner only once a day to deliver food and water. Under no circumstances was he to engage in conversation with the prisoner about anything other than his immediate physical needs. And then came the most chilling line in the letter, a command that reveals the terrifying gravity of the situation. You must threaten him with death if he ever speaks to you of anything other than his needs. This was not a standard prison regulation. This was a clear indication that the prisoner's knowledge, the memories and words locked inside his head, were considered so lethally toxic that the mere act of speaking them was a capital offense. The threat was absolute. Silence or death. Louvois concluded by reminding Saint-Mars that the king expected total obedience, and that his future career depended on his flawless execution of these orders. A month later, in late August, Captain de Voroy and his prisoner arrived at Pignerol. The man named Eustache Dogger was handed over to Saint-Mars, and the heavy doors of his specially prepared cell closed behind him. He had just entered a silence that would last for the rest of his life. Pignerol at this time was already home to several of the king's most famous enemies. The star inmate was Nicolas Fouquet, the once dazzling superintendent of finances. Arrested in 1661 after his ostentatious party at his chateau, Vaux-le-Vicomte, offended the young king, Fouquet had been subjected to a politically motivated trial and sentenced to life imprisonment. He was the ultimate symbol of a subject who had dared to rival the sun. Also imprisoned there was the Comte de Lauzun, an impossibly arrogant courtier who had committed the unforgivable sin of secretly marrying the king's own cousin, the Grande Mademoiselle. These were powerful men, and their imprisonment, while strict, had certain allowances. Fouquet and Lauzun were known by their own names. They were permitted valets to serve them. They managed, through bribery and ingenuity, to communicate with each other, and even with the outside world. Theirs was a political imprisonment. The imprisonment of the man called Dogger was something else entirely. It was an ontological imprisonment. It was designed not just to confine his body but to erase his being. This is underscored by that perplexing phrase in Louvois' original letter. He is only a valet. This statement has been the central enigma for historians for centuries. Why would a mere servant warrant security measures far more extreme than those applied to a fallen superminister or a rebellious count? The contradiction is the key. The state was simultaneously asserting his social insignificance and his overwhelming political importance. Life in Pignerol settled into a strange routine. Saint-Mars diligently guarded his prisoners. For years, Dogger remained in his isolated cell. But then a strange event occurred. Fouquet's own valet fell ill and died. Finding a new trustworthy servant for such a high-profile prisoner in such a remote location was a logistical nightmare. In a move that reveals a certain pragmatic, bureaucratic mindset, Saint-Mars decided to temporarily assign his most secret prisoner, Dogger, to serve the aging Fouquet. This decision seems shocking, a potential breach of security. But it was done under the strictest conditions. Saint-Mars specified in a letter to Louvois that Dogger would only be allowed into Fouquet's cell when the other prominent prisoner, Lauzun, was not present. The implication is clear. The authorities feared that Lauzun, a man who knew everyone who was anyone at court, might recognize Dogger's face or voice. Fouquet, who had been in prison since 1661, was considered less of a risk. He had been out of circulation for years. This brief period of service is the only time we know of when the prisoner was allowed sustained, albeit limited, human contact. After Fouquet's death in prison in 1680, Dogger was returned to his solitary confinement. The door to the world briefly cracked open was slammed shut once more. Chapter 2. The Alpine Interlude Exiles, 1681 to 1687. In 1681, Saint-Mars's years of loyal and discreet service were rewarded. He was given a promotion. He was appointed governor of the nearby fortress of Exiles, another French stronghold in the Alps. It was a step up in his career. And when Saint-Mars packed his belongings for the move, he also packed his secret prisoner. The transfer itself was a clandestine operation. The man who had been at Pignerol for 12 years was moved under guard to his new prison. It is around this time that we begin to see the first hints of the apparatus that would define his legend: the mask. While the original letter from Louvois did not mention a mask, it seems to have become a necessary tool for transporting the prisoner without risking his identification. At Exiles, he was once again placed in a high-security cell, his life a monotonous routine of isolation, his existence known only to a handful of people. We know little about the 6 years he spent at Exiles. It was a quieter, less eventful period than his time at Pignerol. But for the prisoner, it was simply a change of scenery in the same endless sentence. He was now a man in his 40s. He had spent his entire adult life behind walls. The world outside was changing. Wars were being fought, ministers were rising and falling, but his own world remained static, silent, and circumscribed by the ever-watchful eye of Governor Saint-Mars, the man who was both his keeper and his only human link. Their relationship, a strange symbiosis of guard and guarded, had become the central reality of both their lives. Saint-Mars's fortune was built on the prisoner's silence. The prisoner's life depended on Saint-Mars's diligence. Chapter 3. The Island Prison Sainte Marguerite, 1687-1. In 1687, Saint-Mars received another, more significant promotion. He was appointed governor of the fortress on the island of Sainte Marguerite. This was a far more prestigious and lucrative post. The island is one of the Lérins Islands, a short boat ride from the glittering coast of what is now Cannes, on the French Riviera. Its royal fort was a state prison, and its sunny Mediterranean location stood in stark contrast to the grim reality of life within its walls. For a prisoner, the beauty of the surrounding sea and the proximity to the bustling coast would have been a particularly cruel form of torture. And so the prisoner was moved again. Now in his late 40s, he was transported south across France to his new island cage. It was during his 11-year incarceration here, from 1687 to 1698, that the prisoner, once a closely guarded secret, began to transform into a public legend. Unlike the remote Alpine fortresses, Sainte Marguerite was visible. Fishermen and townspeople on the coast could see the fortress walls. Rumors began to swirl about a mysterious high-importance prisoner held there. An officer who served under Saint-Mars on the island, a nephew of the governor's, later recounted his memories of the prisoner. He described a solitary figure who was permitted to walk on the battlements for exercise, but always with his face covered by a mask. The guards, he said, had standing orders to shoot the prisoner dead if he ever tried to remove the mask or speak to anyone other than the governor. The legend grew. It was from this period that the most famous anecdote associated with the prisoner emerged: the story of the silver plate. As the tale goes, one day the prisoner scratched a message onto a silver dish from his meal and threw it from his cell window down towards the shore. It was found by a local fisherman who, being illiterate, could not read the message. He naively brought the plate to the governor's residence. Saint Mars, seeing the scratched writing, was horrified. He questioned the fisherman intensely, his voice trembling. "Have you read what is written on this plate? Has anyone else seen it?" The fisherman swore that he could not read and that no one else had laid eyes on it. Saint Mars, after holding the man for several days to ensure he was telling the truth, finally released him with the chilling words, "It is your great fortune that you cannot read." The story is almost certainly apocryphal, a piece of romantic folklore that attached itself to the growing mystery. But like all good legends, it captures a deeper truth. It speaks to the desperate human need to communicate, to tell one's story, and the terrifying power of the state to suppress that story. The prisoner of Sainte Marguerite was becoming a local celebrity ghost, a faceless phantom whose fame was directly proportional to his enforced anonymity. Chapter 4. The Bastille, 1698–1703. The Final Act. In 1698, after decades of loyal service, Benign de Saint Mars received the capstone to his long career. He was appointed governor of the most famous and feared prison in the kingdom, the Bastille in Paris. It was the highest post a man of his profession could hope to attain, a position of immense trust and responsibility. And as always, when Saint Mars moved, so did his prisoner. The prisoner was now around 60 years old. He had been incarcerated for 29 years. He was prepared for his final journey. The trip from the Mediterranean coast to Paris was a major logistical operation, planned with the utmost secrecy. The prisoner was transported inside a covered litter, a kind of enclosed sedan chair carried between two mules, ensuring that no curious onlooker along the long route north could catch a single glimpse of him. On the afternoon of September 18, 1698, the small convoy arrived at the gates of the Bastille. The prison's lieutenant, a man named Etienne Dujonca, was a meticulous record-keeper. His official diary provides us with one of the most vital and evocative pieces of primary evidence in the entire case. For that day, Dujonca wrote, "At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Monsieur de Saint Mars, the new governor, arrived from his post at the Isle Sainte Marguerite. He brought with him in a litter a prisoner he had in his custody at Pignerol, whom he keeps always masked, whose name is not spoken. The prisoner will be lodged in the third chamber of the Bertaudiere Tower, which I have had furnished with necessities in anticipation of his arrival." The shadow had finally fallen upon Paris. For the next 5 years, the old anonymous man lived in that tower cell. His treatment in the Bastille continued the paradox that had defined his entire captivity. He was a prisoner under the highest security, yet he was treated with a strange, formal respect. Dujonca's diary notes that Saint Mars himself often served the prisoner his meals. The prison physician, who was called to attend to him during his final illness, later reported that the prisoner was a well-built, well-proportioned man who was deeply pious and never complained about his condition. He was allowed to play the lute, but the mask remained. The silence about his past was absolute. He was a man without a history, living out the final days of a life that had been stolen from him 3 decades earlier. Chapter 5. The Erasure. On Monday, November 19, 1703, after a brief illness, the prisoner died. He was, according to Dujonca's diary, found slightly more ill yesterday evening on leaving Massachusetts. The end came quickly. He was approximately 60 years old. The state's machinery of erasure, which had been running in slow motion for 34 years, now kicked into its final frantic phase. There was to be no time for rumors to spread, no time for questions to be asked. The very next afternoon, the body was taken from the Bastille to the nearby parish cemetery of St. Paul de Champs. In the parish register, under the list of the dead for November 20, 1703, a priest made an entry. It read, "On this day Marchioli, aged about 45, died in the Bastille." His body was interred in the cemetery of St. Paul, his parish. In attendance was Monsieur de Rosarges, Major of the Bastille, and Monsieur Ryle, surgeon. The entry was a tissue of lies. The name, Marchioli, was a fabrication. The age, about 45, was wrong by at least 15 years. It was one last act of deliberate misinformation. A final false clue dropped into the historical record to muddy the waters forever. Back at the Bastille, Saint Mars oversaw the final purge. According to accounts passed down from the prison staff and later recorded by Voltaire and others, the prisoner's cell was completely stripped. All his meager belongings, his clothes, his linens, his loot were burned to ashes. The walls of the cell were scraped down and whitewashed. The floor tiles were pried up. The very window frame was replaced. The goal was to ensure that no hidden message, no name scratched into the plaster, no scrap of paper tucked into a crevice, could ever be found. They were not just cleaning a cell. They were attempting to annihilate a memory. The secret, it seemed, was finally safe. The man was dead. His identity was buried. His existence was purged. But Saint Mars and his masters at Versailles had underestimated the power of a good story. In their meticulous efforts to create a perfect void, they had instead created a perfect mystery. A mystery that would outlive the prisoner, outlive Saint Mars, outlive the Sun King himself, and even outlive the French monarchy. And now we must turn our full attention to the question they tried so hard to prevent anyone from ever asking. Who was he?